Hey guys, I'm Professor Malone, and welcome to Day 3 of the Summer Arts Intensive. So yesterday, I went over how to animate a character using Adobe Animate, and today I'm going to go over visual narrative techniques found in comics and animation. So what I'm going to be going over today is something that I love to teach, because it can be applied to any level of skill. Whether you can create photorealistic drawings, or if you can barely even draw a stick figure, these techniques I'm going to be introducing you to will be really helpful to improve your visual storytelling skills as you grow as an artist. So many of these skills can be applied to both comics and animation, but in the scenarios where something will only apply to comics or something will only apply to animation, I hope that you guys still tune in, because having this knowledge will help you be a more rounded individual and a better cartoonist overall. Since I'm going to be focusing more on how to draw your own comics and storyboards today, let's go over the tools that you'll need for it. The first thing you're going to need is going to be a drawing tool of some sort, a pencil. So you can go with a number 2 pencil, you can go with a mechanical pencil. Honestly, whatever you have lying around the house will work just fine for this. Personally, myself, I prefer using a colored mechanical pencil. The one I'm using today is called the Pilot Color Eno, and I have it in blue, I have it in yellow, or actually that might be orange, who knows. I also have it in red, green, I have it in a variety of colors. You could even use a colored pencil for this too if you wish. I just recommend that if you do go with a colored lead instead of just your normal gray color, that you keep it to just one color per page. So I could use blue on one page, I can use yellow on the next page, and on Friday I'll go over in depth why that is. Spoiler alert is going to be mostly because it's going to be easier to be able to remove all traces of the pencil work in your comics or in your storyboards, but I'll go over more about that on Friday. Once we're done penciling, we're going to have to ink our comic or our storyboard. And so I'd like to introduce you to my absolute favorite tool on the entire planet, the Kuraki Disposable Brush Pen. This is my favorite tool because I feel like I'm able to get a variety of line weights with it. It's portable, it's affordable, and a lot of fun to work with. They come in medium, fine, and extra fine, and I prefer using the fine version, but they're affordable enough that you can pick up all 3 of them for less than $10. You can discover which one would work best for your style. Most art stores carry them. They're going to come in a package kind of looking like this. And in case you can't find that, a couple other solutions you could use too. Pentel makes a great color brush as well. So that way you're able to get like a really cool variety of lines from that, and just a really awesome ink style. Now, in case you ever want to be able to work with more of a consistent line weight, as opposed to working with more of a tapered lines like I do, you can even use a few tools like the Faber-Castell Pitt Pen. Micron makes some great pens as well too. But personally, I just use the Kuraki brush pen for like 99% of my work. It's very versatile, and you'll see it in action in quite a little bit. Now, the final tool that I'm going to be introducing you to today is one called the Sakura Perma Opaque marker. This is a dual point marker, so we're able to get like a wide area on one side and another one here. And so whenever I need to get a good consistent line, I have 2 options with this. It's also my favorite tool for filling in large areas of black ink, especially when I don't want to ruin the tip of my brush pen right here, of my Kuraki brush pen. So yeah, this is the final one that I'm going to be introducing you to. Let's go ahead and start making comics. To begin, we need a story. Now, I could talk about storytelling for probably an entire workshop or 2, but to save time, here are some basic cliff notes to work with for creating your own comic or story. Now, most people would say that a story contains a beginning, a middle, and an end. But that doesn't really cover what's contained inside of the story. So, inside of the story, we will find characters, a setting, as well as a conflict. So the final one is going to be the most important part, actually. It's going to be conflict. This is what's going to drive the story and make the story interesting to the reader or the viewer. So go ahead and just choose any words that would fit these three. So I actually have 3 cups that I use at KSU with a bunch of random characters, settings, and conflicts in there. For a few projects, I have students draw from these cups and just work with whatever they pick. So this is my dog, Esper. She loves to fetch, and she's really clever. Clever enough that she's able to use an automatic ball thrower, which makes my life easier. See, she recognizes that. So that makes my life a lot easier whenever I have a big deadline to meet, because she's able to just, play fetch with herself. So my story is going to be about her in the backyard, and the conflict is going to be that her ball is going to get stuck in a tree. So there are lots of different ways to break down a story, and personally, I enjoy breaking it down into 5 parts. First, we got the introduction. So this is where we introduce the character and the settings. Next up is where we introduce the problem. Now earlier, I mentioned that the conflict is what drives the story. So this part, number 2, is going to be an incredibly important part of the story. Number 3 is that you got to live with the problem. We have to illustrate and show the viewer what life is like now. The difference between 1 and 3 now that we introduce number 2. Following that, we introduce the solution. So so here is where we begin to solve the problem number 2. And number 5 will be the resolution. Now, breaking this down into the story with my dog Esper. My introduction is going to be using the ball launcher to have a ball, launched out. Esper's going to be really happy. Status quo. Next up, though, the problem that I'm going to introduce is the ball is going to get stuck in a tree. Then, with living with the problem, Esper realizes that she can't get to the ball. Number 4, where I introduce the fix. Esper finds a pine cone. What was she going to do with it? Number 5, the resolution. Esper's going to use the pine cone to knock the ball down. So I'm going to have her put it into the ball launcher and launch it out and dislodge the ball from the tree. So we have our 5 narrative beats and the basic idea of what our story is going to be. Now, I could take that and divide it among different pages, but what I'm going to do for the sake of this video is just turn each one of these narrative beats into a single panel, creating just a single page story. Alright, so I have the 5 panels in mind of Esper launching the ball getting stuck in a tree. In this case here, I'm going to have it land in a nest. I think that it's going to read a little bit better. Have her look up at the tree to have the feeling of dread just kind of sit in. Have her find a pine cone, and then use the pine cone to knock the ball out of the tree. So, does this comic work? Technically, yes. But I'm going to show you guys a lot of tricks to be able to take this comic and push it even further. One of the first things that we can start doing to make our comics and storyboards look better is to think about how far away our camera is going to be away from our subjects. By changing the distance of the camera from our subject, we begin to see the options we have with how our story can ultimately look. Zooming in and out can achieve totally different looking shots. So here I'm going to have one shot of Esper and the tree all in the same shot. However, you're going to shortly see that that can also be accomplished by having Esper be cropped out, and we're able to see the ball and the nest just shortly out of her reach. Here, we start to notice the difference between comics and storyboarding. In animation, You're limited to the fixed size of the viewing screen. Comics, however, introduce the ability to use the panel shapes themselves to tell the story. See, I can draw a super tall panel to push the fact that my corgi can't get to the ball. The angle of the camera can also change the emotional impact as well. So let's see what happens when I draw the camera looking down on Esper and another of her on the ground looking up at the ball. Now when looking down on Esper, we're going to be doing exactly just that. We're looking down on her. Angles like this can really invoke sympathy. Now, if we were to draw her in a fashion where we're seeing her from the ground up, looking up at the ball, she's going to come across as more stoic and impressive. Choose the angle that is right for your panel. In a way, we're not only conveying information, we're also conveying emotion with what we draw. So next up is one of my favorite things to draw in comics. Using our composition, we're able to direct the viewer's eye. So we can create a line of action that will guide the viewer from one panel to another, or even all over the page. Here, we see the ball is being launched to the left, outside of the page. However, it comes in from the left in the following panel. Yes, this technically works, but it can come across as a little confusing. Now, if I were to draw the ball being fired to the right, and then it comes in from the left in panel 2, we have created a line of action that carries us from panel 1 directly into panel number 2. Now be careful, because sometimes this may accidentally happen when you don't intend it. Watch out for that when you sketch out your comic first. So this concept applies more to comics than it does to animation, but I'm sure that you can find clever uses for it in animation as well. So if we were to have the ball thrower launch the ball off one side of the screen, we're going to anticipate the trajectory of it, and when you have it land, make sure it's going to come in from a direction that we would anticipate. So next up is going to be timing. Comics and animation both tell timing completely differently. In animation, we can actually experience the story in real time. But in comics, there's no clear or set amount of time that can take place between two different panels. Now, let's say we would like to create a beat moment for the ball being stuck up in the tree. We want to do this for comedic purposes. In animation, we would have Esper just looking up at the stuck ball and maybe just, rest on that scene for an extra second or two, just to let that feeling of despair sit in. So, in comics, how do we get that type of timing down if there's no real time happening in each panel? Now, timing in comics is a really fascinating idea. So, in between two panels, there is no set predetermined amount of time between the two different scenes. So here I have the scene of Esper looking up at the tree, and then she sees the ball. How much time has transpired between panels 1 and 2 here? We don't know. We just roll with it, and it works. So let's say we would like to illustrate the passage of time in between the panel of Esper looking up at the ball and then finding the pine cone on the ground. Now, your first thought may be to have a clock to tell the passage of time. Or maybe you might use the sky to illustrate the passage of time. However, comics give us the unique ability to just repeat panels as such to sell the idea that time is passing. So having 3 identical panels side by side may come across as a little bit cluttered, or it may not look as pretty as you want it to. So if we think back to earlier, how a tall panel made us feel the sensation of height. A long panel can also be used to give us the sensation of a longer period of time taking place in the panel. Now that I've covered over camera distance, panel size, different angles, directing the eye, and timing, let's redo that page and see how it looks the second time around. Seeing these comics side by side, I hope you're able to see how we can go from just simply telling a story in sequential order to going to an entire page like this. We're able to use visual narrative techniques to just tell a more interesting and engaging story. Now this is looking more like a comic page. So first off, I designed it to look more like a comic page rather than just panels in a sequence, because comics gives the ability to use the panel shapes themselves as a storytelling device. It would be a shame not to use this to our advantage. Now going into each panel, starting with panel 1, I flipped Esper and the ball launch in panel 1 to easily lead into panel 2, instead of just off the page like the original one I did. I also flipped panel 2 to have the branch lead us into panel 3. So panel 3 is interesting because I thought about going with an upshot here, which would really sell the idea of how tall this tree is. But that gives me the opportunity to add the pine cone here for consistency's sake. To make up for not using the camera angle, I used the shape of the panel itself to add that feeling of height and to add a bit more of time to the shot as we travel down looking at Esper. It was also looking straight up, going whoop, into panel 4. Now panel 4, I pushed the pine cone into the foreground to give us the opportunity to have us look up at Esper, even just a little bit. Now this may not be a dramatic pose looking up at her, but it's just enough to give us the impression that we are looking up at her. Also, the direction of Esper's gaze helps to bring us into the final panel. Now, by changing the panel angle here in panel 5, I'm able to give more focus to the pine cone hitting the ball right here. I thought about going with another upshot here, where Esper would be more in the foreground and we see the pine cone hitting the tennis ball more in the background. But I wanted the focus to be right here of the solution of the pine cone hitting the tennis ball. Also, by adding and repeating the kerchunk sound effect in panel 1 and panel 5, even though the Esper and the tennis ball launcher may be more in the background here, smaller, by repeating that sound effect, we're also getting a better visual effect of what's happening. Now, I also use a few other composition techniques to help out. These tips will help with animation, comics, illustration, photography, and more. So I avoided drawing focus areas in the center of the panels to help create more interesting compositions. By using a technique called the rule of thirds, I create more focus areas, I can introduce conflict, and it's easier to create shots that will direct the eye. Now the rule of thirds is pretty simple, yet really effective. Instead of just drawing a line down the center and having the object be right down the middle, and just kind of focus right in the middle right here, and being centered in the piece. If you divide it into thirds instead, now that's the rule of thirds, like so, we can create a composition that has more contrast, interest, and storytelling opportunities. It will also give us more room instead of having to cram things into the corner around the initial subject. I use the rule of thirds quite often in the new comic. You can see that here in panel 3, where Esper is in the bottom left corner, looking straight up to the top right, where in the top right corner, we have the ball stuck up in the tree. So we have a focal point right here, we have a focal point right here, so that's not only great contrast between the two, it's going to create a good guiding line leading us into panel number 4, where you can also see Esper's in the top left corner, Pinecone's in the bottom right corner, so we're able to see another good contrast right here. That also leads us well into panel 5. Now, the rule of thirds is great because it can be applied to any shape of panel. So as you can see here, I have a tall panel, the rule of thirds applies here. We have more of a wide panel, rule of thirds can also apply to it. So this means that in animation, you're able to do the exact same thing with that because you have a fixed box shape that you're animating in for the duration of your entire cartoon. So next time you're making a cartoon or a comic, try employing the rule of thirds as often as possible, and you'd be really happy with the results you get from it. You'll see this often with two people having a conversation. If one person starts on the left, they should always be on the left, even if that means that you have to use over-the-shoulder shots to accomplish that. Now, if this 180 rule is broken in the same scene or on the same comic book page, then the viewer will have to take a second to realign themselves with your shot, and they may get confused. If you ever watch a fight scene and it's hard to keep up, there's a good chance that this 180 rule is being broken constantly. The final thing I want you to keep in mind when you're making your own comic is going to be the reading order, because in the English language, we read from left to right, up to down. So that means that if we have 3 panels we're working with right here, we're going to read it from left to right, then from up to down. So in the situations where if you have a vertical panel, as such, next to 2 stacked panels like this, we're going to read it from left to right, then from up to down, going from 2 to 3. So watch out when you're making your comics, because you don't want to create a situation where you have 2 stacked panels before a vertical panel. Because we read from left to right first, you may intend for this bottom panel here to be panel number 2. But because we read from left to right, we're going to go from this panel to this one. Now that means that we may either see the original panel 2 as a new panel 3, which would confuse the reader, or even worse, we may have this panel be missed by the reader altogether because they would just continue reading or continuing going down here into panel number 4. Now in today's workshop, I've given you a lot of techniques and rules to work with, but this doesn't mean that those rules are always set in stone. Now I have a simple philosophy in this. Don't break a rule until you understand why it exists in the first place. For instance, Stanley Kubrick purposely breaks the 180 rule in some scenes of The Shining to purposely disorient the viewer. However, he couldn't accomplish that until he understood why he was breaking the rule in the first place and what it would accomplish. I hope that the composition techniques that I covered in today's workshop will help you to create better comics and better animations. So if you haven't picked out your character, your setting, and your conflict yet, go ahead and just go with the first thing that pops to your mind. And then apply them to the 5-beat narrative structure that I introduced you to earlier. Go ahead and just make a 5-panel comic out of it if you want. So here are a couple scenarios you can use if you're stuck with coming up with ideas. Now, when you're coming up with ideas for your comic or your cartoon, and if you get stuck, here are a few ideas that I drew from my idea cups that you can use yourself. So, number 1, I drew dinosaurs as the characters, a magical school, as the scene, and then for the conflict, late to class. All right, so that's scenario number 1. Scenario number 2 you could work with would be vampires. I also grabbed bank. And then the problem that they are out of money. Now number 3, I had dog walker at the beach trying to impress somebody. Now, we have our characters, we have our settings, and we have our scenarios. Feel free to use any of these, whether you just want to grab dinosaurs and make up your own, whether you want to have it be the bank, somebody's out of money, you could come up with whatever characters you want, or you could just go ahead and just grab any of these 3 and just kind of mix and match them together. You can do dinosaurs at the bank trying to impress somebody if you wanted to. Alright guys, have fun. I'll catch you in my next video where I'm going to cover how character design can also tell a story. And I'm also going to go over a lot of techniques to improve your inking skills and your line work in comics and animations. See you then.